Hey everyone! Tonight we're stepping into the frozen forests of North America, where the trees grow so thick that daylight struggles to reach the ground, and the winters are so brutal they can kill you in hours. This is the story of the Wendigo. Before we begin, go ahead and like this video and hit subscribe, but only if this is the kind of content you actually enjoy. And drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? Also, if you're from the northern United States, Canada, or any Algonquian territories, I'd love to know, have you heard of the Wendigo? Any stories passed down from elders? Anything you've experienced in the woods that you can't explain? Now settle in, maybe turn on a fan for some background noise, and let's dive into tonight's story together. When you think of the Wendigo, you probably picture some Hollywood monster with CGI fangs and glowing eyes. Maybe from a video game or a horror movie where teenagers get picked off one by one in a spooky cabin. The kind of creature that looks scary but follows predictable horror movie rules. Stay in groups, don't split up, survive until dawn, roll credits. But the real Wendigo legend? It's so much worse. Because the Wendigo wasn't just a creature lurking in the shadows, waiting to jump out and scare you. It was a curse, a transformation, a warning carved into the very soul of the Algonquian peoples who lived through winters, so harsh that survival often meant making choices no human should ever have to make. The Wendigo doesn't hunt you because it's evil in some abstract movie monster way. It hunts you because it's hungry, endlessly, impossibly, eternally hungry. And here's the truly horrifying part. The more it eats, the larger it grows, and the hungrier it becomes. It's a living paradox, a biological impossibility, a nightmare born from desperation and starvation, wrapped in ice and driven by a hunger that can never, ever be satisfied. And the worst part, the detail that separates the Wendigo from every other monster you've heard of. The Wendigo was once human, just like you. It had a name, a family, people who loved it. And then one winter, one terrible decision, one moment of weakness, and everything changed. The person disappeared, and something else, something horrible, took its place. The Wendigo legend comes from the Algonquian-speaking peoples of the northern forests, tribes like the Ojibwe, the Cree, the Innu, and the Naskapi. These were communities that lived in one of the harshest environments on Earth, a landscape so unforgiving that it makes modern winter camping look like a luxury vacation. Imagine winters where temperatures plunge to 40 below zero, sometimes colder, where snow buried entire villages under drifts so deep you could walk over the roofs of houses, where hunting became impossible because the animals either migrated south or died, and food stores that seemed adequate in November were completely gone by January. In those desperate, frozen months, starvation wasn't some distant fear you read about in history books. It was a neighbor. It sat at the table with you. It followed you to bed at night. It whispered in your ear when you looked at your children and realized you didn't have enough food to keep them alive until spring. And sometimes, in the most desperate moments, in the darkest hours when death seemed certain and madness crept in like the cold, it convinced people to do the unthinkable. The Wendigo wasn't just a campfire story meant to scare children into behaving. It wasn't entertainment. It was a cultural safeguard, a spiritual boundary, a line drawn in blood and ice that said, no matter how hungry you are, no matter how close to death, no matter how much your stomach screams and your children cry, there is a line you must never cross. That line was cannibalism. Because in Algonquian belief, the moment you consumed human flesh, something fundamental changed. You stopped being human. Your heart, literally, turned to ice. Your body began to stretch and twist. Your teeth sharpened into fangs. Your eyes sank into hollow, dark pits. Your skin turned gray and pulled tight over bones that kept growing, elongating, distorting. You became Wendigo, And once the transformation began, there was no prayer, no ritual, no medicine that could bring you back. You were lost forever. The physical descriptions of the Wendigo vary slightly depending on which nation's oral tradition you're hearing, which family is telling the story, which generation carried it forward. But certain details remain chillingly, impossibly consistent across hundreds of miles and dozens of communities that had little contact with each other. The Wendigo is tall, not just tall like a basketball player, or even like the tallest person you've ever met. Tall like a tree. Some stories describe it as 15 feet or more, towering over the forest canopy, its head scraping the frozen branches, leaving claw marks in bark 20 feet off the ground. Its body is emaciated in a way that defies biology. Skeletal doesn't even begin to cover it. Skin stretched so impossibly tight over bones that you can see every rib, every vertebra, every joint protruding at angles that shouldn't exist. It looks like it's starving to death, like it's been starving to death for centuries. And it is. Always. Its lips are often described as torn away or rotted off completely, exposing yellowed, jagged teeth and blackened gums. Some accounts say its mouth is perpetually smeared with blood, fresh or frozen, depending on how recent the kill. Others say it reeks of decay, of rot, of death that never fully dies, like meat left to spoil in the sun and then frozen solid. Its eyes glow, not with warmth, not with life, but with a cold, predatory light that seems to come from somewhere else, somewhere beyond this world. Some describe them as yellow, like a wolf's eyes catching firelight. Others say they're white, like frost, like cataracts, like nothing human has ever looked through. But everyone agrees on one thing. When the Wendigo looks at you, it doesn't see a person. It doesn't see a life, a soul, a story. It sees meat, protein, fuel for the endless hunger. Its hands end in long, twisted claws, fingers that have elongated and curled like the branches of dead trees. Perfect for tearing through flesh and bone. Perfect for digging through frozen earth. Perfect for climbing, for grasping, for the wet work of feeding. Its feet leave strange tracks in the snow. Sometimes they look almost humanoid, distorted and oversized, but recognizable. Other times they're more animalistic, as if the creature can't decide what it is anymore, as if the transformation is ongoing, eternal, never quite complete. And then there's the heart. According to legend, according to the medicine men who studied these things, who dedicated their lives to protecting their people from this curse, the Wendigo's heart is made of ice. Literally, actually, impossibly made of ice. A frozen, jagged lump of crystallized blood and hatred lodged in its chest, pumping nothing but cold and hunger through its veins. Some elders say that's the only way to kill it. You have to melt the heart, shatter it, burn it to ash and scatter those ashes in running water so that no piece can ever reform, can ever find its way back together. Otherwise, the Wendigo will always return. Always. But here's what makes the Wendigo truly terrifying. What separates it from every other monster, every other legend, every other creature that goes bump in the night. It's not just a mindless beast that hunts you. It's intelligent, patient, strategic. It remembers what it was like to be human, and it uses that knowledge against you. The Wendigo doesn't charge out of the woods like a rabid animal, all teeth and claws and mindless violence. That would be almost merciful. No, it stalks you, for days, sometimes weeks. It follows you from a distance, always just out of sight, always just beyond the edge of the firelight, breaking branches deliberately so you know it's there, so you know you're being watched. It mimics human voices with perfect, horrible accuracy. It calls out the names of your friends, your family, your children. It cries for help in voices you recognize, voices you trust, voices that make your heart clench and your instincts scream at you to run toward the sound, to help, to save whoever's in trouble. You might hear your brother's voice shouting for help somewhere in the trees. Desperate, terrified, in pain. You know, logically, that your brother is back in the village, safe by the fire. You saw him there an hour ago. But the voice sounds so real, so convincing, so genuinely afraid that doubt creeps in. What if he followed you? What if something happened? What if he needs you and you just stood here and did nothing? So you run toward the voice, heart pounding, every instinct telling you to hurry, to save him, to not be too late. You crash through the underbrush, calling out his name, promising you're coming. Just hold on, I'm coming. But when you arrive at the place where the voice came from, there's nothing. Just trees, just snow, just the wind moving through bare branches. No footprints, no signs of struggle, nothing. And that's when you realize the voice was behind you the whole time. The Wendigo plays with its prey like a cat plays with a mouse. It's not just hunting for food. It's hunting for entertainment, for sport, for the psychological satisfaction of watching something break. It drives you to exhaustion, to paranoia, to the edge of madness. By the time it finally reveals itself, by the time it decides the game is over, you're too broken, too terrified, too mentally and physically destroyed to fight back. And even if you do try to run, even if some primal survival instinct kicks in and your legs start moving before your brain catches up, it doesn't matter. The Wendigo is fast. Impossibly, supernaturally fast. Some say it moves like the wind itself, gliding over snow without leaving tracks, covering ground that should take hours in mere minutes. Others say it can appear in multiple places at once, as if the forest itself has bent to its will, as if space and distance mean nothing to something that's already crossed the line between human and monster. You can't outrun it. You can't hide from it. You can't reason with it. And once it's chosen you, once you've been marked, the only question left is, how long until it decides to stop playing? Now you might be thinking, okay, but how does someone become a Wendigo in the first place? Is it instant? Is there a warning? Can you feel it happening? Is there any chance to stop it before it's too late? The transformation, according to the legends, according to the oral traditions that have been passed down through countless generations, begins the moment human flesh touches your lips. Not after you've finished the meal. Not after you've swallowed. Not after you've digested it and the nutrients have entered your bloodstream. The moment, the instant, the exact second the taboo is broken. Some stories say you feel it immediately, like a physical shock. A coldness spreading through your chest, radiating outward, reaching your fingers and toes, climbing up your spine toward your brain. Your heartbeat slows. Each thump becomes more labored, more painful, as if your heart is fighting against something, trying to resist what's happening. Your breath turns visible even in warm air, condensing into frost that hangs in the air like a warning. Others say it's more gradual, more insidious, harder to recognize until it's already too late. You eat, and at first, nothing happens. You feel relief. The gnawing, desperate hunger that's been consuming you for days or weeks finally fades. Your stomach stops cramping. Your hands stop shaking. You've survived. You've made a terrible choice. Yes, but you've survived, and surely that's what matters. Surely staying alive is worth any price. But then the hunger returns, stronger than before, more insistent, more demanding. And this time, regular food doesn't help. Deer meat tastes like ash in your mouth. Fish makes you gag. Berries and roots and anything you used to eat, anything normal, anything human, it all tastes wrong now. Rotten, poisonous. Your body rejects it. The only thing that satisfies you, even for a moment, even for an hour, is more human flesh. And so you eat again, and again. And each time, the interval between meals gets shorter. The hunger returns faster. The portions you need get larger. And each time you feed, You grow. Your bones stretch. Your skin pulls tight. Your teeth sharpen. Your humanity slips a little further away, like water through your fingers, like smoke dissipating in the wind, until one day you look at your hands, and they're not your hands anymore. You start forgetting things. Your mother's face blurs in your memory. Your children's names become sounds without meaning. Your own name, the one you've carried your entire life, becomes a distant echo, something that belonged to someone else, someone who died. By the time you realize what's happened, by the time you understand that you're not human anymore, that the person you were is gone forever, it's far too late. You're Wendigo. And the people you once loved, the family you once protected, the community you once belonged to, they're just food now. Walking, breathing, screaming food. The Wendigo wasn't just a supernatural threat that existed in stories and warnings. It was a psychological threat, a mental illness, a culturally specific manifestation of trauma and fear that anthropologists would later document and study and argue about for decades. Wendigo psychosis. That's what they called it. A culture-bound syndrome, a mental condition that appeared almost exclusively among Algonquian peoples, particularly during the harsh winter months when isolation and starvation were most severe. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, there were documented cases, actual recorded incidents, of individuals in northern Algonquian communities who became convinced they were transforming into Wendigos. They would develop an intense, overwhelming craving for human flesh, even when other food was available, even when they weren't actually starving. They would panic. They would beg their families to restrain them, to tie them up, to lock them away, to kill them before they hurt someone, because they believed, truly, completely, desperately believed, that the transformation had already begun, that it was only a matter of time before they lost control entirely. Some of these individuals were killed by their own communities, not out of cruelty, not out of ignorance, but out of necessity, out of genuine belief that a Wendigo couldn't be saved, couldn't be cured, couldn't be allowed to exist. Because in their culture and their understanding of the world, a Wendigo was already dead. The person was gone. Only the hunger remained. One of the most famous cases, one that's still studied and debated and referenced in discussions of cultural psychiatry, involved a Cree trapper named Swift Runner. In the winter of 1878, his entire family went missing. His wife, his 5 children, all of them gone. When authorities finally investigated, when they made the dangerous journey to his remote cabin in the depths of winter, they found evidence that Swift Runner had killed and eaten his wife and all 5 of his children. Despite the fact that he had access to emergency food supplies stored nearby, despite the fact that he wasn't actually starving, despite the fact that he had other options, Swift Runner claimed he had been possessed by the Wendigo spirit. He said it wasn't him. He said he watched himself do it, powerless to stop, trapped in his own body, while something else moved his hands, opened his mouth, fed on the people he loved most in the world. He was tried in a Canadian court, convicted of murder, and hanged in Fort Saskatchewan in December 1879. But even at his execution, even at the moment the rope tightened around his neck, witnesses reported something unsettling. They said he showed no remorse, no emotion. His eyes, they said, were empty, cold, like looking into a frozen lake and seeing nothing but your own reflection staring back. Was Swift Runner mentally ill? Suffering from a psychotic break brought on by isolation, malnutrition, and the crushing psychological pressure of trying to keep a family alive in impossible conditions? Almost certainly. Was he experiencing something that modern psychiatry would classify as a delusion or hallucination? Probably. Or had something darker taken hold? Had he crossed a line that can't be uncrossed? Had the taboo itself, the cultural weight of what he'd done, transformed him into the very thing he'd been taught to fear his entire life? We'll never know for sure. But the legend didn't die with him. If anything, it grew stronger. Let's talk about how the Wendigo hunts, because this is where the legend moves from abstract horror into something visceral, something tactical, something that feels less like a monster story and more like a predator study. The Wendigo begins by isolating you. If you're traveling with a group, if you're part of a hunting party or a family making the dangerous winter journey between villages, it will pick off stragglers first. The person who wanders too far from the fire to relieve themselves. The one who lags behind because they're tired, because their feet hurt, because they're older or younger, or weaker than the rest. They disappear quietly. No screams, no struggle, no warning. One moment they're there, visible in your peripheral vision, and the next moment there's just empty space where they used to be. And when the group realizes someone is missing, when someone does a head count and comes up short, panic sets in immediately. Do you go back to search? Do you risk the entire group for one person who might already be dead? Do you keep moving forward, knowing that every minute you delay makes you more vulnerable? Either choice could be fatal. Either choice could be exactly what the Wendigo wants. The Wendigo knows this. It understands group dynamics, understands fear, understands how humans think and react under pressure. It feeds on your indecision, your guilt, your fear, your desperation to do the right thing, even when there is no right thing. Next comes the psychological warfare. This is where the Wendigo really excels, where it separates itself from simple predators like wolves or bears that kill because they're hungry and nothing more. You hear footsteps crunching through the snow behind you. Heavy, deliberate, too regular to be an animal. You spin around, weapon raised, heart hammering in your chest. Nothing, just trees, just shadows, just the wind. You keep walking, faster now, and the footsteps return. Closer this time. You can hear breathing now, deep and ragged, the sound of something large drawing air into lungs that shouldn't work anymore. You turn again. Still nothing. You hear a voice. Your father's voice, maybe, calling your name from somewhere deep in the woods, off the trail, in a direction you know you shouldn't go. You know, logically, absolutely, that your father is dead. You buried him 3 years ago. You watched them lower his body into the frozen ground. But the voice sounds so real, so clear, so much like him that for just a moment, you can almost convince yourself that you were wrong, that he survived somehow, that he's out there lost and afraid and calling for you to save him. That doubt, that moment of hesitation, that split second where you question what you know to be true, that's all the Wendigo needs. That's the crack in your armor. That's the opening. By the time you've been stalked for days, sometimes weeks if the Wendigo is particularly patient or particularly cruel, you're no longer thinking clearly. You're exhausted. You haven't slept properly in days, because every time you close your eyes, you hear things. You're paranoid, jumping at every sound, seeing movement in every shadow. You're seeing things that aren't there, and missing things that are. And that's when the Wendigo finally shows itself. Not because it has to, not because you've discovered it, or cornered it, or forced its hand, but because it wants to. Because it's done playing. Because watching you break, watching you unravel, watching your sanity slip away piece by piece, that was half the fun. Now here's where the Wendigo legend gets even darker, even more psychologically devastating, even harder to think about. Because in some versions of the story, particularly the ones told by elders who claimed to know people who had encountered a Wendigo and survived, the creature doesn't just eat you, it makes you watch. Imagine this scenario. You're traveling through the forest with your family, your wife, your children, your parents maybe. It's winter, and you're making the dangerous journey to another village where food is more plentiful, where you have relatives who might help you survive until spring. Suddenly, the Wendigo appears. Not slowly, not with warning, just there, impossibly tall, impossibly thin, eyes glowing in the twilight. But it doesn't attack you, not you specifically, not yet. It attacks them, your family, the people you love, the people you've spent your entire life protecting. And it does it right in front of you, close enough that you can see every detail, hear every sound, smell the blood, and you can't move. Not because you're a coward, not because you're not trying, but because the Wendigo has frozen you in place. Some say it has the power to paralyze its victims with a glance, with a thought, with the sheer overwhelming presence of something so fundamentally wrong that your body simply shuts down, unable to process what it's seeing. You're forced to witness every horrifying moment. You watch as it tears into your loved ones. You hear their screams, their pleas for help, their cries for you to do something. Anything. Please. You smell the blood, hot and copper in the freezing air, and you can't do anything to stop it. And when it's finished, when there's nothing left but bones and snow-stained red, scraps of clothing fluttering in the wind, when the screaming has finally stopped, and the only sound is your own breathing, and the wind through the trees, the Wendigo turns to you, and it leaves. It just walks away, slowly, deliberately, without looking back. Because killing you would be mercy, and the Wendigo doesn't do mercy. It doesn't grant quick deaths or peaceful endings. It understands that there are things worse than dying. It leaves you alive, broken, traumatized, hollowed out, knowing that you'll carry that memory for the rest of your life, however long that is. Knowing that every time you close your eyes, you'll see it again. Knowing that you failed them when they needed you most. And maybe, just maybe, if the Wendigo is lucky, that trauma will plant a seed. The seed of madness. The seed of hunger. The seed of transformation. Because sometimes the Wendigo doesn't need to make you one of them directly. Sometimes the horror itself is enough to do the work. Let's talk about the smell, because this is a detail that appears in almost every first-hand account, every story told by someone who claimed to have encountered a Wendigo and lived to tell about it. The smell is always mentioned. Always. It's not just the smell of death, though that's certainly part of it. It's rot, decay, something biological breaking down. But it's specifically the smell of frozen meat left to spoil, of something that should be decomposing, but can't because the temperature is too low. So instead, it just sits there, suspended in a state between life and death, slowly turning rancid. One account from the early 1900s, documented by a French missionary who worked among the Cree people near Lake Winnipeg, describes a trapper who claimed he encountered a Wendigo while checking his trap lines in late February. He said he smelled it before he saw it, a stench so overpowering, so fundamentally wrong, that it made him immediately vomit into the snow. He said it was like opening a root cellar where meat had been stored and forgotten, left to rot for months, combined with the sharp chemical smell of something burning. He turned to run, didn't even think about investigating or fighting or doing anything heroic, just pure instinct screaming at him to get away. And that's when he saw it, standing between two massive pine trees about 30 yards away, perfectly motionless, watching him with eyes that reflected the weak winter sunlight like animal eyes in lamplight. He said he ran for hours, never looking back, crashing through underbrush and snowdrifts, falling and getting up and running again, until he finally collapsed from exhaustion near a frozen stream. When he made it back to his camp the next day, delirious from cold and fear, his clothes still reeked of that smell. He tried washing them in the stream, tried boiling them, tried everything he could think of. The smell wouldn't come out. Finally, he burned them, and he never went back to those woods again, never set another trap, never hunted in that area. He moved to a different territory entirely, and when people asked him why, he would just say the woods had changed, and they'd understand enough not to ask follow-up questions. Another story, this one from an Ojibwe elder interviewed by anthropologists in the 1970s as part of an oral history project, described the smell as sweet and rotten at the same time, like flowers growing on a corpse, like fruit that started to ferment, like something that used to be alive, trying to remember what living smelled like. The elder said that if you ever catch that smell in the forest, you don't investigate. You don't pause to think about it, or rationalize it, or convince yourself it's probably just a dead animal. You run, immediately. And you don't stop running until you're somewhere warm, somewhere with fire and people and light and witnesses. Because the smell means the Wendigo is close, closer than you think. And if you can smell it, the creature has already been watching you for far, far too long. Now, let's talk about Wendigo territory, because this isn't a creature you'll find in just any forest, just any wilderness area. The Wendigo is tied specifically, intrinsically, to certain landscapes, certain conditions, certain places where the natural world becomes something else entirely. The Wendigo belongs to the northern wilderness, the boreal forests of Canada and the northernmost United States, places where winter lasts 8 months out of the year, sometimes longer, where the sun barely rises in December, just a weak glow on the horizon for a few hours before darkness swallows everything again, where temperatures drop to 40, 50, even 60 below zero, where the cold can kill you in minutes if you're not careful, in hours even if you are. These are forests so vast and so empty that you can walk for days, sometimes weeks, without seeing another human being. Forests where the only sounds are the wind howling through the trees and the occasional crack of a branch breaking under the weight of ice and snow, where silence becomes a physical thing, a presence, something that presses against your ears and makes you aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing, your own desperate insignificance. It's in this isolation, this endless white silence, this landscape that seems designed to break human spirits, that the Wendigo thrives. Some elders say the Wendigo is drawn to loneliness specifically, that it can sense when someone is alone, when they've been cut off from others, when they're vulnerable. That's why trappers and hunters were historically the most common victims, or at least the most common survivors who could tell their stories. They spent months alone in the wilderness, checking trap lines, hunting game, with nothing but their own thoughts for company. Others say the Wendigo is territorial, that certain parts of the forest belong to it, have always belonged to it, and if you cross into its domain without the proper respect or protection or knowledge, you've already sealed your fate. You just don't know it yet. There are stories, documented stories, of entire regions being abandoned after Wendigo sightings. Villages relocated to different valleys. Hunting grounds left untouched for generations. Trading routes that used to cut through certain forests being rerouted miles out of the way, adding days to the journey because no one would travel through the old paths anymore. Even today, right now, in the 21st century, there are places in northern Canada and northern Minnesota and northern Wisconsin where locals will refuse to go, not because of wolves or bears, not because the terrain is dangerous, not because there's any rational, explainable reason you could put in a government report, but because of the Wendigo. They'll tell you the forest feels wrong there, that the trees grow too close together, too twisted, at angles that don't make sense, that the silence is too deep, too complete, too much like something's listening, that you get the sense of being watched even when you're absolutely certain you're alone. And if you're smart, if you have any respect for the people who've lived in these places for thousands of years, who've learned these lessons in blood and loss, and winter after winter of barely surviving, you'll listen. You'll go around. You'll add the extra miles to your hike. You'll arrive late. Because some places belong to things that aren't us, and we should probably leave them alone. Let's talk about how you kill a Wendigo, because in the legends, in the oral traditions, in the stories told by medicine men and warriors, and the few hunters who claim to have actually succeeded, it's not easy. In fact, it's almost impossible. And most people who try end up becoming the Wendigo's next meal. Traditional weapons don't work, or at least they don't work the way you'd expect. Arrows bounce off its hide, or pass through it entirely without causing damage. Spears shatter against its bones, like you're trying to stab frozen steel. Knives slip off as if the Wendigo's skin is coated in ice. In more modern accounts, from the 20th century, when firearms became more common in indigenous communities, bullets supposedly passed through the Wendigo like it's made of smoke or mist. They hit where the creature's body should be. You see the impact, but nothing happens. The Wendigo doesn't even flinch. Some say fire is the only answer. You have to burn the Wendigo completely, totally, until there's nothing left but ash. No bones, no scraps of flesh, no hair, nothing. And even then, you have to scatter those ashes far and wide, preferably in running water, so that no part of it can ever come back together, can ever reconstitute itself, can ever find its way back to the world of the living. Others say you have to specifically destroy the heart, the literal heart of ice that beats in its chest. You do this by building a massive fire, heating stones until they glow red, and then somehow getting close enough to the Wendigo to place those superheated stones against its chest until the ice cracks and shatters and melts. But getting close enough to do that, getting within arm's reach of something that wants nothing more than to tear you apart and devour you, that's where most plans fall apart spectacularly. There are stories of warriors, brave, experienced hunters who tracked a Wendigo for weeks, who studied its patterns, who coordinated with others, who set elaborate traps using everything their people had learned over generations of survival in the harshest conditions on Earth. And most of them died, horribly. The Wendigo is smarter than you. It knows you're hunting it, and it finds that amusing. It will let you think you're getting close, let you believe you have a chance, let you position yourself exactly where you think you need to be, and then it will show you that you are never the hunter. You are always the prey. One story, told by Cree elders and documented by anthropologists in the 1920s, tells of a warrior who finally managed to corner a Wendigo in a narrow ravine during a late winter storm. He had tracked it for 3 weeks, barely sleeping, eating only what he could forage along the way, driven by the fact that this particular Wendigo had killed his entire family. He built fires at both ends of the ravine, huge roaring blazes fed by deadfall and dried brush, trapping the Wendigo in the middle. The creature screamed as the flames closed in, a sound that witnesses later described as ice cracking under immense pressure, as metal being torn in half, as something that hurt to hear, that made your teeth ache and your bones vibrate. The warrior stood his ground, chanting prayers his grandfather had taught him, prayers that were older than memory, while the Wendigo thrashed and screamed and tried desperately to escape. He fed the fires for 3 days straight, never letting them die, never sleeping, never eating, just adding more wood and more wood and more wood. When it was finally over, when the Wendigo had collapsed and stopped moving, and the flames had burned down to coals, he spent another day burning what remained. Then he gathered every single ash, every tiny fragment, and threw them into a river that ran fast and cold with snowmelt. And then he walked away, and he never spoke of it again. Not to his children, not to his new wife, not to anyone. Because killing a Wendigo doesn't make you a hero in these stories. It doesn't make you celebrated or honored or remembered. It just means you've seen something no person should ever have to see. It means you've crossed into a part of reality that most people never know exists, and you can never fully come back. Now, here's something that makes the Wendigo particularly unsettling in the modern age. The legend doesn't just appear in dusty anthropology books or campfire stories told by people trying to scare teenagers. There are modern sightings, recent encounters, stories from people living right now today who swear they've seen it. In 1907, a man named Jack Fiddler, an Ojibwe chief and respected medicine man, was arrested by Canadian authorities. His crime? According to the official records, he had killed 14 people over the course of several decades. But Jack Fiddler claimed, insisted, swore until his dying breath that he hadn't killed people. He had killed Wendigos, individuals who had been possessed by the Wendigo spirit and were in the process of transforming, whose humanity was slipping away, who were on the verge of becoming the very monster the community feared most. He said he had no choice, that if he hadn't acted, if he hadn't performed the executions that his role as medicine man required, those transforming individuals would have slaughtered their families, their neighbors, their entire communities. He was protecting his people. He was doing what needed to be done. Jack Fiddler was convicted and sentenced to prison. He died before his execution could be carried out. Some accounts say it was suicide, that he hanged himself in his cell. Others say he died of a broken heart, of the crushing weight of being punished for doing what he believed was right, what his culture and training and responsibility demanded. He maintained until the very end that he had done the right thing, that those 14 people were already gone, already lost, already Wendigo, and that the Canadian courts, with their Western understanding of law and reality and what was possible, simply couldn't understand what he'd been fighting against his entire life. In the 1980s, a group of hunters in northern Ontario reported seeing something in the woods that they couldn't explain, couldn't rationalize, couldn't fit into their understanding of what animals existed in that region. It was early morning, just after dawn, and they were tracking a deer. One of them looked up and saw a figure standing between two trees about 50 yards away. It was impossibly tall, at least 10 feet, maybe more, and it was so thin it looked like a skeleton that someone had stretched and then wrapped in gray, mottled skin. It didn't move. It just stood there, absolutely motionless, watching them. The hunters said later that they couldn't even tell if it was breathing. It looked almost like a dead tree, like something that had frozen in place, except for the eyes. The eyes were definitely alive, and they were definitely watching. The hunters backed away slowly, nobody saying a word, moving in perfect synchronization, like they de-practiced this maneuver 100 times, even though they never discussed what to do if they encountered something like this. When they reached their truck, they got in, started the engine, and drove. They didn't go back to that area for years. And when they finally did, when curiosity and stubbornness and the need to prove to themselves that it had just been a trick of the light or a misidentified bear finally convinced them to return, they found something that made them wish they'd stayed away. Claw marks on the trees. Deep, deliberate gouges in the bark, too high off the ground to be from any animal they knew. And they were fresh, recent, like something had been there just hours before, sharpening its claws, or leaving a message, or marking territory, or all of the above. Let's talk about Wendigo dreams, because this is an aspect of the legend that doesn't get enough attention, that often gets overlooked in favor of more dramatic physical encounters, but that elders insist is just as important, just as dangerous, just as real. According to the oral traditions, according to medicine men who specialized in these things, the Wendigo doesn't just hunt you in the physical world. It hunts you in your sleep. It walks through your dreams like they're hallways, like they're territory it owns, like your subconscious mind is just another forest for it to stalk through. People who've spent time in Wendigo territory, who've camped or hunted or lived in areas where the creature is known to appear, often report the same recurring nightmare. The details vary slightly from person to person, but the core experience is identical, unnervingly so. You're walking through a forest. It might be a forest, you know, a place you hunt every year, or it might be somewhere unfamiliar, but it feels wrong somehow. The trees are too close together, the shadows are too dark, the silence is too complete, and then you hear footsteps behind you. Not loud, not obvious, just the soft crunch of snow or the rustle of dead leaves. You turn around, nothing there, just trees and shadows. You keep walking, faster now, and the footsteps continue. They match your pace exactly. When you slow down, they slow down. When you speed up, they speed up. You're not alone, and whoever or whatever is following you wants you to know it. You start to run. The forest seems endless. The trees all look the same. You're running and running, but you're not getting anywhere. Like you're stuck on a treadmill, like the forest is rotating beneath your feet. And then you see it, the Wendigo, standing in the distance, maybe 100 yards away, perfectly still, just watching you with those hollow, glowing eyes. You try to scream, but no sound comes out. You try to run, but your legs won't move, like you're frozen in place, like you've been turned to ice from the feet up. And the Wendigo begins to walk toward you, slowly, deliberately, like it has all the time in the world. Some people wake up before it reaches them. They jolt awake gasping, drenched in sweat despite the cold, heart pounding so hard they think they're having a heart attack, absolutely convinced they were about to die. Others don't wake up so easily. They're trapped in the dream, watching the Wendigo get closer and closer, unable to move, unable to look away, until finally it's right in front of them, close enough to smell that sweet rotten stench, close enough to feel the cold radiating from its body, like standing next to an open freezer. And then they wake up screaming. Here's the disturbing part, the detail that makes these dreams more than just nightmares, more than just your brain processing fear and campfire stories. These dreams often come in clusters. Entire communities will report Wendigo dreams at the same time, all within the same few days or weeks, as if something is moving through the area, brushing against everyone's subconscious, marking territory in the space between sleeping and waking. Elders say that Wendigo dreams are a warning, that the creature is nearby, closer than you think, testing your fear, measuring your weakness, deciding whether you're worth hunting. And if the dreams continue, if they get worse, if they start happening every night instead of just occasionally, it means the Wendigo has chosen you specifically, and you need to leave immediately. Pack whatever you can carry and go somewhere else, somewhere far away, somewhere the Wendigo's influence doesn't reach. Because if you ignore the dreams, if you convince yourself they're just nightmares and nothing more, eventually you won't wake up at all. Now let's talk about Wendigo possession, because in some versions of the legend, in some families' oral traditions, you don't have to eat human flesh to become a Wendigo. Sometimes the spirit can just take you. Sometimes the transformation happens whether you want it or not. It usually happens in winter, during the coldest, darkest months, when people are isolated and vulnerable, and the line between sanity and madness gets thinner with every passing day. You might be alone in a cabin, snowed in, with no one around for miles and miles. Or you might be part of a group that's trapped somewhere, running out of food, running out of options, running out of hope. And then you start to feel it, a coldness in your chest that has nothing to do with the temperature outside. A sensation like ice water being poured directly into your heart. Your heartbeat slows. Your breathing gets shallow. Your fingers and toes start to tingle and then go numb. You look at your hands and they seem wrong somehow. Too long, too thin, the skin pulled too tight over the bones. Your reflection in a window or a piece of polished metal looks strange, distorted, like you're seeing someone else wearing your face. And then the thoughts start. Intrusive, horrible, unwanted thoughts that you can't control and can't stop. You look at your dog, your loyal companion who's been with you for years, and for just a split second, you think about how much meat is on its bones, how long you could survive if you just... You shake the thought away immediately, horrified, disgusted with yourself, physically nauseous at the idea. But it comes back, again and again, getting stronger each time, getting harder to resist. You look at your traveling companion, your friend, someone you've known your entire life, and you start calculating. They're weak, sick, slowing the group down. Everyone would be safer if they were gone. And besides, they're going to die anyway. Why let that meat go to waste? Some people, in the old stories, recognized what was happening early enough to ask for help. They would beg their families or their communities to restrain them, to tie them up, to keep them away from others until the possession passed, until whatever evil spirit had taken hold finally moved on. They would volunteer to be isolated, to be locked in a separate building or chained to a tree, anything to keep themselves from hurting someone they loved, because they could feel their humanity slipping away. They could feel something else taking control. Others didn't realize until it was too late, until they woke up surrounded by blood and bones and torn clothing, with the taste of copper in their mouths and no memory of what they'd done, just empty hours where their minds should have been. Wendigo possession was taken so seriously, treated with such gravity and fear, that some Algonquian communities had specific protocols for dealing with it. Rituals designed to drive out the Wendigo spirit before it fully took hold. Ceremonies that lasted for days, involving fasting and chanting and offerings to protect his spirits. Medicine men who specialized in this, who dedicated their entire lives to studying the Wendigo and how to fight it, were some of the most respected and feared members of their communities. They carried knowledge that was both necessary and dangerous. They walked closer to the line than most people ever should. But even with all that knowledge, all that ritual, all that spiritual power, they couldn't always save someone. Sometimes the possession was too far advanced. Sometimes the person was already too far gone. Sometimes the only mercy left was a quick death before the transformation could complete. Because once you became Wendigo fully, once that final threshold was crossed, there was no coming back. The person you were was gone forever, and what remained had to be stopped. Let's talk about the Wendigo's voice, because this is one of the most disturbing aspects of the legend, one that appears in nearly every account, nearly every story, nearly every warning passed down from elders to children huddled around fires. The Wendigo can mimic human speech perfectly, flawlessly, with such accuracy that even people who've known the imitated person their entire lives can't tell the difference. It doesn't just make random sounds or guttural approximations of words. It can speak in the exact voice of someone you know and trust, your brother, your wife, your child, your mother, your best friend. It captures not just the sound but the cadence, the accent, the small imperfections that make each voice unique. Imagine you're alone in the woods, setting up camp for the night. The sun has just set, and you're building a fire, arranging your supplies, checking your weapons. And then you hear your daughter's voice calling out from the trees. "Dad? Dad, where are you? I'm scared. Please help me." Your heart stops. Your daughter is back in the village, safe by the fire. You know this. You left her there this morning. You specifically made sure she stayed behind, because this journey was too dangerous for a child. But the voice sounds so real, so terrified, so desperate. Exactly how she would sound if she was lost and afraid and calling for you to save her. Do you investigate? Do you grab your spear and run into those trees, following the sound, determined to protect your child no matter what? Or do you stay put, trusting your knowledge that she can't possibly be here, that this has to be a trick? That's the trap, the impossible choice. The Wendigo knows exactly how to exploit love, how to weaponize your protective instincts, how to use your humanity against you. One story from the 1920s, recorded by a priest working in northern Quebec, tells of a trapper who heard his wife's voice calling for help in the middle of the night. He grabbed his rifle and ran into the forest, following the sound, shouting back that he was coming, that she should keep calling so he could find her. He ran for over an hour, crashing through underbrush, stumbling over roots and rocks, following that voice. But no matter how fast he ran, no matter how much ground he covered, His wife's voice remained exactly the same distance away. He never got any closer. And then he heard it. Laughter. Not his wife's laugh. Something else. Something cold and mocking and utterly inhuman. A sound that froze him in his tracks more effectively than any chain. He turned and ran back toward his camp, but he'd gotten turned around in the dark. He was lost. Completely, totally lost. He wandered for 3 days before he stumbled out of the forest near a different settlement, delirious, frostbitten, barely alive. He never trapped again, never went back to that cabin, never returned to those woods. And when people asked him what happened, what he saw during those 3 lost days, he would just shake his head and say 2 sentences. It wasn't her. And it knew I'd come. Now here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. Something that adds another layer of horror to an already terrifying legend. The Wendigo doesn't just kill. It doesn't just hunt. It transforms the landscape around it. It corrupts the very forest it inhabits. Areas where a Wendigo has been active, where it's hunted and fed and walked for years or decades, are described by people who've been there as wrong. That's the word they use most often. Just wrong. The trees grow twisted and gnarled, branches bending at angles that don't make sense, trunks spiraling like they're trying to escape their own roots. The snow in these areas takes on a grayish tint, like it's been stained by something invisible. Animals flee. You'll never see deer tracks in Wendigo territory. Never hear bird song. Never spot rabbit or fox, or even the small animals that usually survive anywhere. Even the air feels different, heavier somehow, colder, even when you're just a few hundred yards from areas where the temperature is normal. Like crossing an invisible threshold, drops the temperature 10 degrees instantly, regardless of weather or sun, or any logical explanation. Some say the Wendigo corrupts the land itself, that its hunger spreads like a disease, infecting everything it touches. Plants wither even in summer. Water turns foul, developing a strange oily sheen and a taste like iron and rot. The forest begins to die from the inside out. There are stories of hunters who stumbled into these dead zones accidentally, and immediately felt a sense of dread so overwhelming, so primal, that they turned around and ran without even understanding why. Just pure instinct screaming that they needed to leave, that they weren't welcome, that something fundamentally opposed to human life existed in that place. Those who ignored that instinct, who pushed forward because they didn't believe in legends, or because they thought their weapons and experience would protect them, rarely made it out. And the ones who did come back were never quite the same. One account from the 1950s describes a logging crew in northern Manitoba that accidentally clear-cut into what locals called the Hungry Woods. Nobody had warned them. Either the company didn't know or didn't care. Within days of starting work in that area, the crew began experiencing strange phenomena. Tools went missing. Not just misplaced, but vanishing entirely from locked toolboxes and secured storage sheds. Food spoiled overnight, developing mold and rot that shouldn't have been possible in the cold. Men reported hearing voices at night, calling their names from the forest, voices that sounded like family members who were hundreds of miles away. Then the accident started. A chainsaw malfunctioned, blade flying off and nearly taking off a man's leg. A tree fell the wrong way despite proper cutting technique, crushing a truck. 2 men got into a fistfight over absolutely nothing, had to be physically separated, and neither could explain afterward why they'd been so angry. The foreman, a practical man from Minnesota who didn't believe in superstitions, who'd logged for 30 years without incident, finally shut down the operation after one of his men was found wandering in the woods at 3 a.m., barefoot in the snow, covered in scratches that looked self-inflicted, muttering about the tall man with no face. They abandoned thousands of dollars worth of equipment, just left it there, got in their trucks and drove back to civilization and never went back. The logging company tried to send a different crew a few months later to retrieve the equipment and finish the job. That crew made it 2 days before they also left, and the company finally marked that entire section of forest as unsuitable for logging. Economic loss be damned. Let's talk about children and the Wendigo, because the relationship between the creature and the youngest members of indigenous communities is complex and deeply disturbing in ways that are hard to fully articulate. In the legends, children are both the most vulnerable to the Wendigo and, strangely, sometimes the most protected. The Wendigo is drawn to innocence and purity in a way that makes the horror even worse. Some say it's because consuming a child's flesh provides a twisted, temporary relief from the endless hunger, like the innocence somehow counteracts the corruption, if only for a moment. Others say it's because children haven't yet learned to fear properly, haven't developed the instincts and caution that help adults survive in the wilderness. They're easier prey, more likely to wander off, more likely to follow strange voices or investigate unusual sounds. But there are also stories, strange, disturbing stories, of children being spared. Not out of mercy, because the Wendigo doesn't do mercy, but out of something darker and more calculated. The Wendigo will sometimes follow a child for years, watching them grow up, appearing at the edges of their vision, making sure they know it's there, but never quite attacking. Waiting. Why? Because the Wendigo remembers what it was like to be human. And seeing a child, innocent and untouched by the horrors of the world, is a reminder of what it's lost, of what it can never have again. That reminder is simultaneously attractive and repulsive. Some stories say the Wendigo will even protect a child from other dangers. Wolves, bears, hostile tribes, as if claiming them for later. As if saying, "This one is mine, and no one else gets to touch them." There's a particularly chilling account from the early 1800s about an Inu girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, who got separated from her family during a blizzard. She wandered for 2 days, certain she would freeze to death, her small body already shutting down from cold and exhaustion. Finally, she found shelter in a small cave, barely more than a depression in a rock face. But it was out of the wind, and that was enough. Inside the cave, she saw scratch marks on the walls. Deep, deliberate gouges that went all the way through the frost to bare stone. And in the back of the cave, partially buried in snow and shadow, was a pile of bones. Human bones. She knew she should leave. Every instinct told her to get out of that cave immediately, but the storm outside was too fierce. The wind was strong enough to knock her over. The snow was blinding. She would die out there in minutes. So she stayed, huddled in the corner farthest from the bones, wrapped in her inadequate furs, praying to spirits whose names she'd barely learned. At some point during the night, she couldn't tell when because time had stopped, meaning anything, she heard something enter the cave. Footsteps, slow and heavy, crunching through the snow. The sound of something very large, moving carefully through a space barely big enough to contain it. She squeezed her eyes shut, too terrified to look, too terrified to move, too terrified to even breathe properly. And then she felt it, a presence, towering over her, standing so close she could feel the cold radiating from its body like waves. But it didn't touch her. It just stood there, watching, breathing softly, for what felt like hours, but might have been minutes or might have been seconds, because terror does strange things to time. When she finally opened her eyes, dawn light was filtering into the cave, and she was alone. The presence was gone, and miraculously, impossibly, the storm had passed. She made it back to her village. She grew up, married, had children of her own. But for the rest of her life, she would sometimes wake in the middle of the night with the absolute certainty that something was standing at the foot of her bed, watching her, waiting. She died in her 70s, and her grandchildren said that in her final days, when the fever had taken hold, and she was drifting in and out of consciousness, she kept talking to someone they couldn't see, someone she called the Tall One or the Watcher. And on the night she died, several people in the village reported the same dream. A tall, impossibly thin figure standing at the edge of the forest, perfectly still, as something small and bright, maybe a soul, maybe just a light, rose from the village and drifted toward it. And then both the figure and the light were gone. Now let's talk about the Wendigo in modern times, in the age of smartphones and GPS and satellite imagery, in a world where we've mapped every forest and documented every species and convinced ourselves that there are no more mysteries left. The legend hasn't faded. If anything, it's growing stronger, spreading further, evolving in ways that would have been impossible before the internet. Online forums dedicated to cryptids and unexplained phenomena are filled with Wendigo accounts. Some are obviously fake, creative writing exercises, or attempts to go viral. But others are harder to dismiss. Detailed descriptions from people who have no apparent reason to lie. Accounts that match the traditional legends with eerie accuracy, despite coming from people who claim they'd never heard of the Wendigo before their experience. In 2014, two 12-year-old girls in Wisconsin attempted to murder their classmate as a sacrifice to Slender Man, a fictional internet horror character. The case made international headlines and sparked extensive discussions about how online folklore and mythology can influence behavior, especially in young or vulnerable people. But some researchers and folklorists pointed out an uncomfortable parallel that didn't get as much attention in the media coverage. The Wendigo. The Wendigo legend, they argued, has always been about how stories and cultural narratives can shape actions. How belief in something can make it real in ways that matter. How the line between myth and reality isn't as clear as we'd like to think. The Wendigo is as much an idea as it is a creature. It's a manifestation of taboo, of cultural anxiety, of the fear of what humans are capable of when pushed to extremes. And ideas, once they take root in the collective consciousness, are very hard to kill. They spread, they mutate, they adapt to new contexts. A legend that warned against cannibalism during harsh winters can evolve into a warning against consumption in general, against greed, against the mindset that says, more is never enough. There are YouTube channels dedicated to analyzing Wendigo sightings, TikTok videos where people share their encounters, Reddit threads with hundreds of comments debating whether specific incidents could be explained naturally or whether something genuinely paranormal occurred. In 2019, a hiker in northern Minnesota posted a video online that supposedly showed a Wendigo. The footage is grainy, shot on a phone from a distance, shaky, because the person filming was clearly terrified. You can see a tall, extremely thin figure moving between trees in a way that doesn't quite look right. The proportions are off. The movement is too fluid and too jerky at the same time. The video went viral. Millions of views. Thousands of comments. Experts analyzing every frame, looking for evidence of CGI or costume or camera tricks. Most concluded it was fake. Some weren't so sure. The hiker who posted it never did another interview after the initial media attention died down. When reporters tried to follow up months later, they couldn't find him. Phone disconnected. Social media deleted. Like he'd vanished entirely. Probably just someone who wanted privacy after their 15 minutes of fame. Probably. Let's talk about what happens if you survive a Wendigo encounter. Because in the legends, in the oral traditions, survival doesn't mean escape. It doesn't mean you get to go back to your normal life and forget what happened. Those who faced the Wendigo and lived often describe lasting psychological effects that never fully go away. Nightmares that continue for years, sometimes decades. Paranoia, a constant feeling of being watched. An inability to be alone in forests, or sometimes even in wooded parks in urban areas. Some become obsessed. They spend years researching the creature, collecting every story they can find, trying to understand what they saw, trying to make sense of an experience that doesn't fit into any rational framework. They fill notebooks with sketches and theories. They travel to remote areas interviewing elders. They become amateur anthropologists driven by trauma rather than academic interest. Others go the opposite direction. They refuse to speak of it ever again. Not to family, not to friends, not even to therapists who might be able to help them process the trauma. Because they believe, sometimes correctly, that speaking the name might call it back. That acknowledging what happened might draw its attention again. There are stories of survivors who moved far away after their encounters. To cities, to places where forests don't exist, where everything is concrete and streetlights, and the closest thing to wilderness is a small park with manicured grass. But even then, thousands of miles from where it happened, they can't shake the feeling that something is wrong. One account from the 1970s describes a man who claimed he encountered a Wendigo in his early 20s while hunting in Quebec. He survived by hiding in a hollow log for an entire night while the creatures circled around him, sniffing, scratching at the wood with those terrible claws, making sounds he said he still heard in his nightmares 40 years later. He moved to Toronto immediately after. Never hunted again, never went camping, never visited forests. But decades later, living in a high-rise apartment building surrounded by millions of people, he still kept every light in his house on at night. He refused to go into basements or enclosed spaces, and he never, ever closed his bedroom door completely. His family thought he was just eccentric, maybe a little paranoid. They didn't know about Quebec. He'd never told them. What would be the point? They wouldn't believe him. Or worse, they would. He died in his 70s, in a hospital room, with his family around him. And according to his daughter, who was holding his hand when it happened, in his final moments, he opened his eyes one last time. And he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at something in the corner of the room, something she couldn't see. And he said very quietly, "I see you." And his eyes closed, and he was gone. The family assumed he was seeing angels or deceased relatives, the usual comforting interpretations people make when someone's dying. But his daughter said something about his expression bothered her. He didn't look peaceful. He didn't look welcoming. He looked resigned, like he'd been waiting for this visitor his entire life, and it had finally arrived. Now here's the question that haunts every discussion of the Wendigo, every academic paper, every late-night conversation around campfires or in comment sections. The question that no one can definitively answer, no matter how much evidence they accumulate or dismiss. Is it real? Skeptics will say no. Obviously not. The Wendigo is a myth, a cultural narrative, a story used to enforce taboos and explain psychological trauma. Every sighting can be attributed to misidentification bears, moose, even just trees in fog, creating pareidolia effects. Wendigo psychosis can be explained as culture-bound mental illness, delusions brought on by stress and isolation and malnutrition. And maybe they're right. Maybe every single account, every story, every encounter can be explained through a combination of psychology, biology, and cultural anthropology. But then you talk to people who've been there, not tourists or weekend campers. People who've spent their entire lives in those forests. Hunters who know every animal, every sound, every natural phenomenon their environment can produce. Elders who've heard the stories firsthand from people they trust, from medicine men and warriors and survivors. And they'll tell you, often reluctantly, always seriously, something is out there. Maybe it's not a literal monster in the way we think of monsters. Maybe it's not a physical creature you could capture and study and dissect. Maybe it's something else entirely. A manifestation of collective fear that becomes real through belief. A psychic imprint left by centuries of trauma and starvation and desperate survival. An echo of the worst moments in human history, given form and hunger and teeth. Or maybe the Wendigo is exactly what the legends say it is. A creature born from the violation of nature's most fundamental taboo. A thing that exists in the coldest, darkest places, in the spaces between trees, in the silence before dawn. and the moment when you realize you're truly alone. Either way, the Wendigo endures. Not just as a story, not just as a warning, but as something that shapes behavior, that influences decisions, that makes experienced hunters choose different paths, and forces communities to abandon profitable territory. The Wendigo endures because it serves a purpose. It reminds us that there are lines we shouldn't cross, that some hungers shouldn't be fed, that the wilderness, despite all our technology and mapping and scientific understanding, still holds spaces we don't fully comprehend. And maybe that's okay. Maybe we don't need to fully understand everything. Maybe some mysteries should stay mysterious. Some places should stay wild. Some warnings should be heeded, even if we can't prove they're necessary. Because the cost of being wrong is too high. So what's the takeaway from all this? What does the Wendigo teach us? Assuming legends can teach anything, assuming old stories still matter, in a world of artificial intelligence and genetic engineering and space exploration? The Wendigo teaches us that greed and hunger are never satisfied. That the more you consume, the emptier you become. It's not really about cannibalism, not literally. It's about the mindset that says more is always better, that there's never enough. That satisfaction is always just one more acquisition away. We see this everywhere in modern society. Corporate greed that destroys ecosystems for quarterly profits. Consumer culture that promises happiness through purchases, but delivers only temporary satisfaction, followed by renewed wanting. Addiction in all its forms, whether to substances or success or social media validation. The Wendigo is what happens when wanting becomes all-consuming, when appetite transforms into identity, when the hunger becomes more real than the person. It teaches us that isolation is dangerous, that community, connection, and care for one another are what keep us human. The Wendigo thrives in loneliness. It hunts people who've been separated from their groups, from their support systems, from the networks of relationships that provide meaning and purpose. In our increasingly atomized society, where people can go days or weeks without meaningful human contact, where loneliness has become an epidemic, where connection has been reduced to likes and follows and digital interactions, maybe the Wendigo's warning is more relevant than ever. It teaches us that some taboos exist for reasons that go deeper than religion or social control, that there are lines we've drawn not arbitrarily, but because crossing them changes something fundamental. The Wendigo isn't just a punishment for breaking rules. It's the inevitable result of violating the basic principles that make society possible. And maybe most importantly, it teaches us to respect the unknown, to honor the stories passed down by those who came before us, to remember that the world is stranger and darker and more complex than we like to admit. The Wendigo still walks. Maybe not in your neighborhood. Maybe not in your lifetime. Maybe not in any literal physical sense that could be documented on camera or captured in a cage. But it walks in the frozen forests of the far north, in the spaces between stories, in the part of your mind that wonders, late at night when you're alone and you hear a sound you can't explain, whether you're really as safe as you think you are. And if you ever find yourself alone in the woods, in winter, when the sun has set and the temperature is dropping and you're farther from civilization than you'd prefer to be, and you hear footsteps that aren't yours, and you smell something sweet and rotten on the wind, and you hear a voice calling your name in a tone that's almost right, but not quite, remember this. Don't follow the voices. Don't investigate the sounds. Don't look back. Just move quickly, toward light, toward people, toward anywhere that isn't there. Because the Wendigo is patient, and it's been hungry for a very, very long time. Sleep well.